All right, welcome everybody. It's a big pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the VUB. You will be welcomed on behalf of the ULB, our sister university, or I should say our mother university. In a couple of minutes, I'm the Vice Rector for Research at VUB. And since the topic of this afternoon, or one of the topics of this afternoon, is academic freedom, I was asked to say maybe a little bit about that subject. In fact, at VUB, we approved last year, we approved the new charter of the researcher, and that charter is one that every researcher at VUB has to comply with. And that delineates a number of obligations, but also a number of freedoms that I think are crucial in this debate. And it's also important to distinguish between different freedoms. There are three types of freedoms that we talk about in that charter. And the first one is basically the freedom or the autonomy of the university. And that means that we as a university, we are a free university, Vrije Universiteit, oh no, it's not there. Vrije Universiteit of Brussels means that we are not a, let's say, a neutral university, but we are a value-driven, we are a free university. We were founded together with ULB as free from church and state, free from the meddlings of church and state. We are a value-driven organization, and that means that it doesn't mean that we as a university have to be an activist university, but it does mean that we have a responsibility to speak out, always with a sense of responsibility, with a sense of reason, with a sense of those values that we represent, and with a sense of international law. I just came from Antwerp, where the VUB, together with University of Ghent and University of Antwerp, granted an honorary doctorate. It was the first time that the three universities granted one together to Francesca Albanese. We got a lot of criticism for that, but again, with a view of speaking out for reason, speaking out for international law, we thought that was important. The second freedom that we delineate is the academic freedom, but on the level of the individual researcher. And that is sometimes not understood. Academic freedom is first and foremost at the level of the individual researcher. It protects the individual not just against the outside world, but also against their own university, against their own university authorities, I would say. And then, of course, well, I am one of those authorities, then I have to say immediately that freedom is, of course, not absolute, because academic freedom, on the one hand, it grants you a whole amount of freedom. On the other hand, it also means responsibility. It means adhering to scientific standards, always being open for peer review and peer criticism. And then the final freedom that we talk about in the charter, and again it is related, but it is something else, is freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is basically about the world of opinions. And those can go further than what you have researched. They can pertain to also what you put on social media. But it's something different than academic freedom. That is the realm of opinions, and there basically we ask our employees to adhere to the legal boundaries of freedom of speech, and that is not calling for violence and not calling for hate or discrimination. And so those three values, they are mixed, they are muddled, and it's not easy to distinguish, but I think it's very important to distinguish them. And those three freedoms, they can sometimes clash. Sometimes the autonomy of the university clashes with the academic freedom, and sometimes that clashes with freedom of speech. It's not an easy debate, but a very important one, and so therefore I'm glad that you are here so numerously, because these are very important, very relevant debates to be had. And to be had also here in BrIAS, the Institute for Advanced Studies of the VUB and the ULB. We are now in our fourth year, fifth year, something like that. It's still new, it's still fresh. There is a program now on democratic governance, and so this fits democratic governance, democratic resilience. This really fits, the lecture that you will hear really fits within that theme. So I'm really glad that you are all here. I'm really glad that our speaker is here, and I wish you all a very stimulating and enlightening debate. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students. It is a great pleasure to welcome you today at U Square, this shared site of the Université Libre de Bruxelles and Vrije Universiteit Brussels, a place that reflects our shared commitment to openness, cooperation, and academic dialogue. VUB and ULB, which were until the early 70s one single university, have a long-standing tradition of defending academic freedom and supporting scholars at risk. This commitment is deeply rooted in our common history. From hosting refugees during the dictatorship of Salazar in Portugal and Franco in Spain, to supporting exiled academics during the regime of Pinochet in Chile, our universities have consistently stood on the side of those whose freedom to think, to teach, and research was under threat. Today, this commitment is embodied in various concrete and lasting mechanisms. Among them, I would like to mention the ULB's Khaled al-Assad Solidarity Fund, which was created in 2016 and which provides sustained support to postdoctoral researchers at risk, enabling them to continue their work in a safe academic environment. Each year, the fund supports several scholars from across the world, threatened because of their research, their ideas, or their commitment to truth. Since its creation, we have welcomed researchers from countries which are very diverse, from Turkey, Syria, Iran, Russia, China, Cameroon, Burundi, and I can mention many other countries of origin, reflecting the global scale, persistence, and growing intensity of the risks faced by researchers and academics today. The fund is one example of our actions in the field. Together, these actions form a coherent and enduring policy, not only to affirm our values, but to translate them into concrete support. Such support is also illustrated by the close collaboration VUB and ULB entertain with the Scholars at Risk network. It is within this broader framework that we are particularly pleased to welcome Professor Mark Bray, who has himself become the target in the US of intense harassment and serious threats from far-right movements. These threats led him to make the difficult decision to leave the US with his family and seek safety in Spain. His experience reminds us of the very real challenges faced by scholars whose work or ideas put them at risk. And it shows us, of course, that one should not take academic freedom for granted. Professor Bray, dear Mark, we are really honored to welcome you here at ULB and VUB. Your presence among us gives a very concrete resonance, I would say, to the values we strive to uphold. Thank you for being with us here. We're looking forward, of course, to your lecture. And I would like also to take the opportunity to thank very much our colleagues and BrIAS, of course, to have organized this conference. So many thanks to Professor David Paternotte, Archibald Gustin, Benoît Henriet, et Benjamin Declaine. Thank you.
So well, thanks again, BrIAS, for welcoming us here. And it was extremely easy and smooth to work together. And they were very enthusiastic about this invitation. So thanks a lot. So the idea briefly of why we have decided to invite Mark is... oh, sorry. That was okay to be Anna. So what we have tried to do with a group of colleagues, also from other universities, not only the VUB and the ULBs, we have started to work and to think about how we deal with the extreme, and especially with the far right in all universities. And the idea is to invite or to talk as a way to start with that conversation with colleagues who have actually faced that sort of attacks in other contexts. And it's how very rapidly in the brainstorming sessions we had, Mark's names came saying, well, this is probably someone we should try to talk to. And so we could reach him. That was also very smooth and easy. So thanks for coming, for accepting. And Mark was in Brussels this week, so that was also the other easy thing. So we decided to invite him for this lecture. And just to be very brief, so Mark is a professor of modern history at Rutgers University in the United States, and he has worked on modern Spain, which is important also for the other connections. So working on the history of anarchism, anti-fascism, and I will come back to that in a moment, but also for this university on the history of Francisco Ferrer and the modern school, which is central to the history of the ULB and the VUB. And as Anne has already mentioned, and Mark will go further into that, so he's very famous for his book on Antifa that was translated or will be translated in 6 languages. So it's Portuguese, French, so you don't need to speak English if you want to read it, Spanish, Italian, but also I've just learned Japanese and Greek are coming soon. And because of this book and his research on anti-fascism, he was targeted by different organizations and different political actors, including Turning Point, so the organization that was led by Charlie Kirk, so the guy who was murdered, that probably have heard of. And then he was specifically targeted because of his work on anti-fascism. And it's also why, as Anne said, he had to flee to Spain to be able to continue his work and his teaching. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Wow. Great turnout. Thanks for coming. Given that this is organized by 2 universities and an institute, the number of thank yous is a little overwhelming. But thank you, David. Thank you to everyone at the VUB and the ULB. Thank you to Anya, Benjamin, Benoit. I'm sorry, the number of names, it's been a whirlwind, but it's been a pleasure to meet everyone. So what I'm going to do today is speak about what I've been through personally over the past half year, a bit about the book, trajectories of fascism and anti-fascism in the U.S., and what that may mean moving forward in the U.S. and in Europe. Before I get to that, a note on standing versus sitting. In Spain, all the talks are sitting down. The speaker's sitting down, always sitting down. And in the US, an event like this would be standing up. So in a sense, I feel a little bit more at home with the standing up. So I appreciate that. So it's lovely to be here, although it's not fully spring weather yet. It's lovely to be here this spring. But it wasn't my plan to be in Europe this spring. It was to be in the US teaching my students in person. But as a number of you probably heard, I was targeted in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk shooting for a book I had written 8 years earlier, which... as we academics know, if you published a book 8 years ago, usually no one is contacting you at all about that book. But this is the kind of contacting I did not want. And I ended up here. So let's talk a little bit about fascism. Fascism is a notoriously difficult concept to define, in part because historically fascists have been ambivalent, if not dismissive, of rational consistency, right? Mussolini famously said, "Do I contradict myself? I don't give a damn," right? But I think that as a historian, it's helpful to think of anti-fascism and fascism historically. So fascism was, among other things, an effort to take forms of popular politics mobilized by what we might in retrospect refer to as the left, by socialists and anarchists and trade union political parties and organizations, where you would have big rallies and newspapers and youth organizations and women's organizations. And that thrust of popular activity, which was largely alien to reactionary politics in the 19th century. Right? During that time, if you look at the suppression of the Paris Commune, for example, right, the reactionary forces would kill a bunch of rabble-rousers and Reds, but largely they did not want to fundamentally transform the fabric of society, and they didn't want people mobilized. They wanted social control to continue to be exerted by those traditional forms such as the church, social organizations, the family, and society, right? But fascism, it's no coincidence that Mussolini was a socialist before he became a fascist, aims to take those forms of social mobilization that the left had gained a lot of political ground with, but drain their content, repurpose their content. Instead of internationalism, ultranationalism. Instead of women's rights and feminism, misogyny. And use those forms of popular politics to, paradoxically, use modern forms of politics to return to a past, right? They view the aftermath of the French Revolution in the modern political world as their enemy, as this kind of corrosive force destroying allegedly natural hierarchies of domination, and they wanted to return. So I think of it in terms of, sometimes I talk to my students about the movie Back to the Future, which increasingly they don't even know what that is. But the movie Back to the Future, right? There's a Back to the Future. They want to use modernity to destroy modernity, or at least so they claim. Thinking of violence as this inherently cleansing force, not just a means to an end, right? To destroy those who they accuse of distorting natural hierarchies, in which case I was speaking to Archibald earlier. I did get your name, right? Yeah, all right. I had this moment where I was like, oh no, I just called someone the wrong name. About gender being like absolutely central to what fascism was back then and to what far-right and fascist politics are today. So, a little gloss on that. Let's turn to the U.S. The story's a little different in the U.S. Robert Paxton, the historian Robert Paxton, said that maybe in a functional sense, the first proto-fascist formation in history were the KKK after the American Civil War, right? They've got not the same outfits as the black shirts or the brown shirts, but it's an outfit-based sort of vigilante form of suppressing a marginalized group through redemptive violence. You can see some threads. But of course, the story is much deeper than that, right? Hitler was very influenced by American eugenics programs. He was very inspired by the American example of the genocide of the indigenous population, depopulating the American West as his vision of depopulating Eastern Europe. So in that sense, the influences in terms of the history of far-right politics have gone both ways. It's also, I think, helpful to throw into the conversation the argument made by Ami Césaire and others that Hitlerism was a form of European imperialism or colonialism brought home to Europe. And that's something that I think is a really keen observation and is essential to this conversation. So if we think about it that way, did the U.S. have fascism? I would reverse the question. I wouldn't say that what the U.S. had was fascism so much as fascism was this sort of subset of imperialism, and therefore, connected to that, I think we can think of anti-fascism as a historical subset of anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism. And in that way, the U.S. has that kind of imperial legacy, right? It is empire. It is genocide. You see why the far right loves me, right, in the U.S. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to talk about changes in American far-right politics, particularly after World War II. So there's a book, I don't know if it's been translated into French, but if it has not, someone should get on it. I think it's really good. Joseph Franzak, historian at Princeton University, wrote this really neat book called Everything is Possible. And he makes two really great arguments that I think are largely, if not entirely true, but you can decide for yourselves. And don't throw tomatoes at me if you disagree with these. Throw tomatoes at him. But the first is that prior to the mid-1930s, fascism and anti-fascism were really pretty much paradigms that were exclusively reserved to Italy and the Italian diaspora. And it was not until Hitler took power and you have far-right groups around the world more actively copying the fascists that fascism expanded to become not an Italian-specific term, but a broader international term, and simultaneously anti-fascism. That one's pretty cool. The far more mind-blowing one is that the left, as we know it today, as this transnational, nebulous, historical actor that can be said to do things collectively, that interpretation of the left, he argues, didn't exist in political discourse prior to the mid-1930s. That when people talked about the left prior to that, they were referring to specific groups of parliamentarians or specific branches of certain parties. They weren't talking about it in globalized terms. Implicit in that is that the same thing can be said of the right. So in that sense, if we're following him on that, and you can decide whether you want to or not, the left is anti-fascism in the 30s, and the right is more or less fascism. In the US, after World War II, we certainly had the patriotic narrative of, we beat the Nazis. No one else participated in that, just Americans, by the way. Just so you're clear. No, but that is what a lot of the American far right would have you believe. We beat the Nazis, but we didn't do so in the name of anti-fascism. Anti-fascism was still a term in the US associated with the left, associated with, for example, the members of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion who went over to fight in the Spanish Civil War and then came back to the US and were blacklisted for their alleged or real communist politics. So in the era of McCarthyism, which for those of you who are not as familiar with American history and politics was the kind of the Red Scare of the 1950s, there were liberals and conservatives, but people didn't really talk of themselves as left and right because it was sort of associated with being a fascist or an anti-fascist in a way that was kind of outside the mainstream of American politics. Moving into the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement was a very successful historical social movement that normalized in mainstream society an antagonism towards racism. And so a huge shift happens after that where the mainstreams of both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, establish a kind of superficial, you could call it in the most minimal sense, anti-racist consensus. Both political parties, the mainstreams, agree that racism is bad, but then they also agree that, guess what, racism's over. It was bad, but it's over, right? And when that happens, important shifts happen with the American far right, who are not down with that even superficial anti-racist consensus. One thing that happens is you get the development of more of a kind of anti-state far-right insurgency. There's a writer named Matthew Lyons who wrote a book called Insurgent Supremacists. It's I don't know if it's been translated into English, but it's very good and it covers that shift and all the different political permutations of what that means. But that's the sort of historical thread towards, for example, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, is those kinds of anti-state, far-right, white supremacist insurgents who view the American state from around the era of the civil rights movement onward as no longer protecting white supremacy, but being, depending on the flavor of description, secretly controlled by the Jews. And here you can see, although France can take the credit for the Great Replacement theory, there were elements of it in the ether all over prior to that, and you can see it starting to bubble up at this point as well as sort of thinking about the deep state, which interestingly enough was a concept that sort of was developed by left and right-wing figures, but has subsequently become pretty much an exclusively right-wing concept as far as I can tell. And this superficial anti-racist consensus survives through, in what I would argue, draining a lot of progressive and left-wing discourse into a kind of seemingly neutral liberal language. So take, for example, what we thought of as discrimination, or even how we described racism in the US as at a mainstream level, right? When I was a kid, growing up, white kid, suburban New Jersey, racism was mistreating someone based on the color of their skin. Now that dehistoricized, decontextualized description created the opportunity for the far right to say, hey, I have white skin, so policies that give opportunities to people of color are discriminating against me because of the color of my skin, right? So that's one of a number of examples, which I'll come to later, of how this kind of liberal discourse created space for the far right to normalize their ideas in the US in a way that led to where they are now. This started to change, I guess you could argue, with, well, the end of the Cold War was a big moment where a lot of the far right, as much as they hated the American state for civil rights, was still sort of allied with the American state because of their anti-communism and their opposition to the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended, there was less of an incentive to do that, right? We get the really growth of the militia movement in the United States. I understand there are fewer guns in these kinds of countries than over there, but there's an awful lot of guns in the US. And there's an awful lot of groups of usually white men out in the woods with guns. And so you see that really take off in the 90s. And then Obama becoming the first African-American president, right, with the election of 2008. And the subsequent decade, the last decade, from about, let's say, 2011 with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I participated in New York City, up through Black Lives Matter, feminist organizing, Me Too, LGBTQ organizing, opposition to oil pipeline construction. We had this incredible decade of social movements and progressive left-wing politics in the US, right during and after the first African-American president. And this is where this superficial anti-racist consensus falls apart completely on both sides. On the one side, you have Black Lives Matter, which is, you know, the most profound American social movement we had probably since the 70s, saying, no, look, racism is still very much alive and never went anywhere, to the point where Hillary Clinton, as mainstream a Democratic politician as you can find, is sort of forced to admit that structural racism continues to be a problem in the US. On the other side, you have the Republican Party with the development of what was coming to be called by around 2014 the alt-right, the alternative right, starts to say a couple of different things. One, there's one version of it that says, nuh-uh, no, it's not a real thing. And then another slightly less popular one that says, yes, it is, but that's a good thing. And you see both of those, they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth frequently. Let's pause a little bit to talk a little bit about the alt-right. So throughout all of these difficulties, I've had the fortune of meeting a lot of really great researchers. So there's a plus. And I met this researcher in Madrid, an American person who's researching the development of the alt-right out of all of this very bizarre network of different kinds of people involved with Gamergate and explicit white supremacists and Nazi organizations and neo-Confederates and incels. Is that a term that's made its way over here? Incels? Sorry. But it wasn't until journalists started writing about it as this thing, taking the term coined by Richard Spencer and other white supremacists a few years earlier, that people in this movement started to say, yeah, we are part of the alt-right. So it's funny how the media and discourse can influence things. But anyway, in this context, I think you can see the rise of Trump's presidency the first time around, both as him pushing the alt-right forward, but also being pushed by it. There's this sort of, I think, a reciprocal influence. And race was absolutely central to it. This is the context of protests against Confederate statues and monuments around the US, which the right tried to portray as history. But actually, most of those monuments were not created right after the American Civil War. In the 19th century, they were mostly created during the era of civil rights in the 60s and 70s as ways to intimidate African-American populations. So that's the history that it really is. Plus, of course, I mean, I'm speaking to a room full of academics. I don't need to convince you of this. But if they really cared so much about history, why are they defunding universities and archives and libraries? But I digress. Anyway, race was certainly central to that. So was gender, right? This is the context of Me Too and cancel culture, of the manosphere, books written by pickup artists, the aggravations of incels. Another book, I like to recommend books because I know there's always someone who's like, yeah, I'll check that out. It's On Microfascism, written by Jack Bradich, a colleague of mine at Rutgers. On Microfascism makes this case for gender and misogyny being at the center of fascism. It's a good book. So the alt-right develops and tries to position itself as its own space in mainstream American politics, largely through the internet, largely through social media and videos and 4chan and Reddit, but also by establishing their own street presence. So you see a lot of these far-right groups starting to feel emboldened, having their own demonstrations which elicit clashes with anti-racist and anti-fascist activists really starting to get going 2015, 2016. And these efforts peak with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in August